Hello there and welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project. Now in the Synapse lookbook I wore a couple of sleeveless knit mock necks and was talking a little bit about how I've been playing around with stretch fabrics and trying to make top patterns for those and a couple of dresses out of those. And I really did just cobble those patterns together to work on those projects for that video, but I wanted to do a more official version and I wanted to walk you through exactly how I was taking my basic blocks that I use for wovens and using those to make a basic block to use with stretch and knits. As we know, I don't necessarily use knit fabrics like knit jerseys and like traditional t-shirt fabrics. I tend to go for more sparkly spandex sort of thing, swimwear fabric almost, and like dancewear fabric. Tends to be why I'm using stretch. It's for the special effects more than anything. And there are many ways to make a basic knit top pattern. I've seen people do it from tracing t-shirts or tank tops that they like in their closet, or doing it straight from measurements. I'm going to be using my basic blocks that I use for wovens as a starting point today, mostly just because I don't want to have to remeasure myself and do it from measurements. So I'm just using the measurements of my block to achieve this top pattern today. But I'll show you exactly what I mean over on the blue patterning table of doom, as always. And I say more official, but you'll see just kind of how slapdash this still is. So I have my bodice block back here. I'm going to trace that along a center backed line here that I have on my alphanumeric paper, trace that dart in, but really I'm just going to slide this along and remove 2 inches along the center back of this and then trace it again. So you can see I have the pattern layered over that center back line and I'm tracing this with those 2 inches along the center back removed. That leaves me from the underarm to the center back with about 10 inches here, and at the waist about 8.5. My bodice block pattern does have an inch of seam allowance. That's removing that, and then an additional inch of ease, leaving me with 10 inches at the underarm, which is about 1/4 of my bust measurement, and 8.5 at the waist, which is a little over 1/4 of my waist measurement. And I will remove a 1/2 inch along the waist because I need this to be a little bit smaller, if not a little bit smaller than this. I'm going to leave a tiny bit of more ease in the waist of this than I would normally, just because anything I ever wear, it's going to be tucked in anyway, so that my skirt waistband or whatever I'm wearing will hold in the last little bit of ease that I leave in here at the waist if I wanted to. But I'm just extending this down, you know, I don't know, 4 or 5 inches past the waistline. Again, this is just a little bit to tuck in here. I can make this longer if I ever wanted to actually make a properly length shirt if I wanted to, and I will refine that when I try on the mock-up in a minute. Now up here for the neckline, all I'm going to do is from the first tracing of my actual bodice block, I'm going to bring that closer to the center back, and then on the new tracing, I'm going to bring that a 1/2 inch closer to the center back. So I've just moved that to create a new shoulder. This shoulder line will be modified in a minute anyway. This is a very tiny little shoulder. I don't know why I thought that would work, because I just have this tiny little strap of a shoulder here, but I'll fix that later. I'm just making this as a first round because we're going to make a mock-up and then change things. And again, the stretch of the fabric is going to do a lot of the work for us today. Unlike having to fit things perfectly and make sure our dart fullness is exactly what we need and stuff like that, knit fabrics are a whole different ball game. And I'm no expert in this. This is just what I did to get my patterns to work. There are many ways to do this again, so this may not be the perfect way for you, but it is just what worked for me. All right, so once again, I have a tracing of my front bodice block this time here. Yes, I know the lighting has switched quite dramatically. Hopefully it's better now though, you know what I mean? So I have my back pattern here that we just made. I'm going to line up the center back with the center front, like so, and then slide this up until the shoulder lines meet, and then I will trace the new back shoulder line onto this front one here. So I'm going to mark that. Again, it's much smaller, narrower shoulder. I'll end up having to fix that, but for now, we get the idea. I'll mark the shoulder on here. Now, my armhole on my regular bodice block is very acute. It's like very curved, and that's because of my full bust adjustment and the darts on my bodice. I don't need it to be that shape when I'm using a stretch fabric, so I will go ahead and trace the back armhole as a starting point onto this front here as well. So I'm really using the back as a starting place for this, but I just wanted to trace the front bodice block underneath so you could see what is kind of happening. And I'll trace the side seam and the waist in here as well, just so I can have those as a guide point, because of course this needs to match up along the side seam eventually. So the only changes I'm really going to make to this, or I'm going to bring out right here across the bust, basically the high bust point here, I'm going to add in a 1/2 inch along here compared to the back. So that's now 10.5 inches basically. And I'm going to taper that down into the waist like so. So this is now, I'm going to write 10.25, but it's 10.5. I don't know. I can't measure, I guess. 10.25, more like 10.5, like I said. So the front, across front measurement is going to be a little bit larger than the back, because in the back, I do not have my bust to contend with, and in the front, I do. Let me just smooth off my neckline and my shoulder here. And then for this, again, arm side, I'm going to bring this down a 1/2 inch right here where it is most curvy on the actual arm side of my woven pattern. I will make it a little curvier on this version as well. So it's a little curvier than the back. It comes in, you know, against, like, towards the center of my chest, I guess, a little bit further than it does in the back. And I will have to tape on a little bit of paper here to make sure it's the same length as the back pattern, but I will go ahead and use the back as a way to do that. But I can trace this buddy out. Again, it's very similar to the back. It's just a tiny bit wider across the bust, basically, is what's happening here. So you can see if I line this up with the back pattern, it's just a little bit larger at the underarm or across the bust area. And the armhole comes in a tiny bit extra. But otherwise, I'm just going to have it follow this same line here, and we can make adjustments from there. The only other change from the front and the back pattern is that the back neckline is a little bit higher than the front, because that's how the body is, kind of. But anyway, let's make a mock-up of this and see how it's actually looking in fabric. This is a cotton jersey from the super sale section at Joann's. You can tell it's from the sale section because I grabbed a nice spiderweb Halloween themed one. I grabbed a couple of yards of this to be able to make mock-ups so I could show you what's going on. But I just cut out my front and my back out of that stretch, and I will just stitch these side seams together and the shoulder seams together. I am going to be using my Burnett 35 machine today, which is not my favorite thing to do because we all know I love my Singer 99K. But here's the B35. We don't actually get along very well, but this one is my modern machine that has all the bajillion different styles of stitches, and I'm using a faux overlock stitch for this. You could use just a regular old zigzag for this and it will still work, but, or of course you could use a serger or overlocker, those kind of things. If you have those, my serger, the tension is all off, so I'm not bothering to fix that to use it for this. I'll just use the faux overlock stitch on this machine. And of course, your machine stitches available may vary, so look at your manual and see if there's something called a faux overlock or a faux surged stitch. But here is the little vest I just made, basically. You can see that I really just need to bring that shoulder back out, and we have a little bit of an extra here. Now, in a woven, I normally have to put a dart when I'm making patterns right here, this extra bust dart area. But this isn't a ton of extra fabric, and I think that once I put the sleeve on, this won't actually be a problem, so I'm not actually too worried about it. And other than this being a little bit big, I think it's actually a pretty good fit. But I will go ahead and draft a quick standing collar to make this into a mock neck. So I'm gonna just make a rectangle. Basically what I've done here is I've measured my front and back neckline and added those together and then subtracted 1 inch from that. So you want this band around the neck to be at least 1 inch smaller than the exact measurement of the neckline, so that it cinches it in just a bit. So that's all I'm really doing here. It's, you know, if it needs to be 10 inches, I'll make this 9, basically. Adding the front and back neckline measurements together to achieve that, and then subtracting 1 inch. This is only about 3 inches tall. Needs to be maybe twice that to be a proper mock neck. This, you'll see, looks much more like a crew neck in the end. But we're just binding the neckline edge, essentially. And like the taller you make that binding, the more of a collar or like neck you have, essentially. So you can make a full turtleneck if you wanted to by making that a good 6 inches tall. So the collar is just a band. And again, I'm going to be making a mock-up here to perfect this or get it how I want. But more importantly, I need to make a sleeve. Now to do so, again, I'm going to reference my actual sleeve here so I can get the length of this, and I'll just trace that sleeve cap that I have on my normal woven sleeve, and you'll see how different it needs to be for this knit version today. But again, I'm just using my patterns as a base to start with, so I know things need to be 22.5 inches long. That's how long my sleeves usually are. I need to mark my wrist measurement on here because I want this to be quite a fitted, like, close sleeve, and then I just need to make sure this fits into the armhole of the pattern I just drafted, basically. And to do so, my sleeve cap here is very, like, flat, I suppose, and I need to have a much taller standing sleeve cap. So we're gonna have to figure that out. And the reason I need to have a taller sleeve cap is because I need the sleeve cap gets set into the arm side, basically. It needs to be the same measurement as the opening in the shirt, but my bicep measurement is only like 13 inches, and so I need it to narrow down to 13 inches, and right now the bicep measurement of this woven sleeve is much higher than that. So I'm going to kind of measure down from the top of my sleeve to where, like, the underarm, like, widest part of my arm would be, which is around 7 inches, and I'm going to draw a new line 7 inches down from, like, my original sleeve cap height, basically, because the length of my entire arm hasn't changed. This still needs to all be 22.5 in the end. So I'm just coming down a little bit further here, and I'm going to mark out 7 inches from either side of the center of this, so I can have 14 inches on this line total, because again, the measurement around the top of my arm at the underarm level around my bicep was 13 inches, and so 14 with seam allowance a 1/2 inch on either side there. At this point of the sleeve, I need it to taper down basically to 14 inches. And you can see that is at least 2 inches smaller than my other sleeve cap normally is. So we have to draw a new sleeve cap here. I'm going to connect up from that 7-inch outline on either side up to the original tip of my sleeve cap up here. And I'm going to separate each of these lines into 4 sections. So I'm finding the center and then the center of each of those sections, separating each of these lines into fourths. It doesn't matter what the measurement is, it just matters that it's in 4 equal sections. And from the 2 lower sections on either side, I'm going to come in 1/4 of an inch. And then from the 2 top sections of this, I'm going to come out 5/8 of an inch. This is just kind of a basic way to draw a sleeve cap. If we have to adjust this, we have to adjust this. But again, in stretch, it's much more of a flexible situation than in a woven. And then I'm going to connect these lines. So I'm drawing a curved line through that 1/4 inch mark up through the 5/8 inch mark. And this is just how I'm finding the new sleeve cap. I hope this makes any sense. If you want how to draft a sleeve video, this will make much more sense. So I'll put a card up to my how to draft a standard woven sleeve video here, so you can get an idea of how sleeves in general are done. This is just a simplified version of that for doing this with knits, basically so that I can have the arm side and the sleeve cap match up, but still have this sleeve narrow enough that it's quite tight to my arm. Now you can see on the scrap of paper here, I have the measurement listed for the front arm at 10 1/4 inches and the back arm at 10 inches from the pattern pieces we just drafted. So when I measure this curve of the arm side, I need to make sure that it is 10 inches, 10 1/8 around this area, close to these measurements. So that's why this curved line needs to be around 10 inches on either side. And using this method, luckily it worked out to be near right on for me. I don't know if that's because this is a good method or if I just got lucky, honestly. And then I'm just narrowing down from there to the hem of the sleeve, which I have at 7 inches because that's my wrist measurement. So this is going to be my stretch sleeve version 1. Here's the center of that. Either side actually of the front and back of this is the same currently. I'm just used to marking the fronts of my sleeves so I don't get confused, but truly the sleeve will be the same on either side. Of course, I might need to modify things, but sleeves are not something I'm a super expert in either. Of course, fit is one of those. I do more style modifications and design modifications than fit modifications. I'm not a trained tailor enough. So things I would like to learn more about over time, but currently I'm not an expert in. But here's my sleeve, here's my collar piece. I'm going to grab some spare pieces of fabric so I can cut those out. So let me just find some scrap jersey here so I can cut out that collar and those sleeves. And we can try and make a full version of a top here and see how it, if it fits better once there is a sleeve in there. I think it will. There wasn't too much floop at that underarm that I was very worried about. So hopefully with the sleeve set in there, it should work. The first steps for this are going to be to sew the shoulder seams together, but not the side seams yet, because I'm going to set my sleeves into this flat. So I'll show you that as well here, but I'll sew the shoulder seams again with that funky faux overlock stitch over here on the B35. I'm sewing this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance as opposed to my usual 1/2 inch, by the way. Just usually what I do for stretch, especially because I'm not ever adding any additional seam allowance and stuff. I'm kind of making these patterns exactly my size and then relying on that 1/4 inch seam allowance everywhere being taken off to give me the bit of negative ease I want. Really, I recommend, just like how when I made a woven block, I had to make a couple of mock-ups to get exactly everything I wanted. Same with this. So now I have my neckline here, and I'm just going to mark the center front and back on that because basically this neckline is in fourths. There's a center front and back, so there's 2 sections of either the front and the back if you count the side seams. And the same for this collar. So I have my collar sewn together here. I did actually use a straight stitch to sew the collar into a circle like this because this isn't going to get a ton of stress. I felt I could get away with using straight stitch on that. Mostly you want to use zigzag or some sort of a stretchy stitch, otherwise you'll be pulling, snapping threads all over the place and you'll be very upset. But on this, just to sew this collar together, I went ahead and did straight stitch. But I'm going to fold this in half like so that it will become a taller collar. And then I can, again, mark my center front. If the seam on this collar is going to be the center back, I will use that to mark the center front and the 2 sides as well. So on this buddy, this is going to be, the seam of this will be sewn to the center back, if I can get myself organized. And then I want to mark the sides, but instead of marking it right at the side where it needs to be, I'm going to come over a 1/2 inch because the back, of course, I need less and the front I need a little bit more. So again, hopefully this makes any sense. Oh no, what a disaster I am. The thing is, things work easier, you can fudge things so much more in knit fabrics. I find the problem with knits is that each knit fabric is its own animal. So sometimes I'll use a spandex jersey, like floopy metallic fabric that's really on the silky side, and it has a lot of stretch to it. And then I'll use something that's like a spandex swimwear fabric that looks very similar, but is actually a lot thicker and doesn't stretch, and like it has a lot more of an elastic feel to it. It doesn't stretch as much. And I can use the same pattern with that, and it's going to fit completely different because the amount of stretch in the fabric. And so I find stretchy fabric really annoying and variable in that way. But basically I just want to mark the neckline into fourths, the collar into fourths, so I can match those up and make sure I'm stretching everything to fit. Because again, the neckline is 1 inch bigger than the collar here, so I need to ease that extra fabric in by pulling it taut like this while stitching around. Oy! Stretch. It's not my home base, pals. I'm a wovens gal. Please forgive me. But here I have the like extra bit taken off the machine so I can really get in here. And I'm using that thick stitch again. Still using 1/4 inch seam allowance on this. Which kind of gives me a 1/2 inch seam allowance, if that makes any sense, because this stitch is about a 1/4 inch wide. But you can see I'm holding the fabric and kind of pulling as I go around to make sure this stretches to fit perfectly, even though the neckline is 1 inch bigger than the collar. Anyway, I sewed that right sides together. Now I'm going to come along the outside here, switch to a zigzag stitch, and kind of do like a top stitching right over to hold the seam allowance down to the shirt side of this. I guess you could stitch it up if you wanted to, but then your collar would start getting really thick. But I'm using a zigzag here as a top stitch just to hold that seam allowance down. It's almost like understitching, but on the outside. And so I guess it's just top stitching. Yeah? Yeah. Edge stitching with a zigzag. I'm finding the center of my sleeve here because that will, of course, line up with my shoulder seam here. I have my shoulder seams, I can't press my seams open on this because the seam is that weird stitch. So I just press everything towards the back is my standard for that. But I have my, shirt open flat looking down at the collar here, and we're looking at the front and back, which are not sewn together at the side seams. So I can pin my sleeves on flat like this. So I pinned to the center, I pinned to the underarm, and now I'm pinning everything in between. This should line up perfectly because of how I drafted the sleeve. But if it doesn't, again, both sides stretch, so you can fudge it a tiny bit within at least a 1/2 inch of fudging room here, as compared to when working with wovens when, things don't stretch, I guess. And I will stitch that in again using that same stretchy stitch over here on the B35. And because this machine is much more sensitive and we don't get along, you can see I'm trying my best to remember to remove my pins, because while the Singer 99K and I have an agreement, this machine and I are less close, to one another, and it doesn't always do as I wish. But once that sleeve is sewn on flat like that, I can line up my side seams and the sleeve underarm seam at the same time. Again, I'm going to put the seam allowance for that underarm seam towards the sleeve cuff, so face both bits of seam allowance outwards, and then I will sew the underarm seam and the side seam of the shirt itself in one long go. So that's what's happening here. I think a lot of patterns out there in the world tell you to do the side seam and the sleeve seam like this at the same time. Of course, I haven't, followed pattern directions in like a decade, so my directions usually come from my brain telling me, hopefully logically, which is the next step to do. Still using my weird stretch stitch over here and just stitching that long seam like so. Of course, I'll do the same for both sides, by the way. Set the sleeve into the other side and then sew the side seam of the other side as well. The only problem with these stretch stitches is it's taking so many stitches per inch that you do run out of bobbin thread really quickly, which is quite annoying. And while I'm here, I'm just going to go ahead and take that extension off the machine and try and hem my sleeve. I just turn that under a 1/2 inch, use that same stitch, and finish it. There are probably prettier ways to do this, but usually in the fabrics I'm using, you can't see the stitches because you're blinded by the sparkle, so it's not usually a problem that they're stitching there. Here's what this buddy looks like all done. And you can see this is not the color I was showing you. This is a smaller color because sometimes continuity-wise I have to try again to show you what the heck I'm doing. You can see the shirt's a little bit big, it's probably nicely sized, but on me I would like something a little bit tighter. The shoulder is in an okay place, at least in this fabric, but let's try something more like the fabrics I would actually use so we can get a better idea. Because everything's working out kind of too nicely at this point, and I'm like, this is suspicious. So let's take my pattern over here onto iridescent snakeskin print swimwear fabric. Again, this is a high spandex content. This is less floopy and more structured than that cotton jersey I've been using to do mock-ups. So this is going to feel a lot more like the fabrics I actually use. And I think, again, because stretchy fabric is so variable, I will have to make adjustments to my pattern based on the fabrics I like to use, which is not something I ever do with wovens. With wovens, I use the same like types of fabrics so often that I'm not worried about changing the pattern depending on what fabric I'm using. Whereas in stretch, it's something I definitely worry about. But the order of operations will be the same here. Again, I'm going to start by stitching the shoulder seams together, then I will do the collar, then I will do the sleeves flat again, and the side seams like kind of last, and then hem everything basically. So same order of operations, just slightly different fabric. And this one will go ahead and show me all of the problems that are still inherent in my pattern. So that's nice, because this fabric is much more restrictive, I guess, compared to the soft cotton jersey. This one's a little thicker, and again, a lot more like straight up elastic as opposed to cotton, because there's no cotton in this one. It's just, I don't know, nylon, polyester, all synthetic to create, you know, faux holographic snakeskin. Can't be doing that in cotton yet. Here I'm using pins to find my front and back, and so separate the neckline into fourths, and then I will, of course, again, attach my collar onto here. And again, the mock neck on this can barely get over my head. Like, it is super tight. So in a fabric like this, I quickly realized I would have to make my neck opening larger, because this is very small to try and get over my head. And I'm thinking, gosh, this is going to be a tight fit. And the answer is, yes, it is. So once again, the problem arising from having a variable amount of stretch in my fabrics. Like, this fabric would be great for like leggings, but it's a little thick almost for tops. It's really like leotard or swimwear fabric is what this is. But I will go ahead and put my mock neck onto here. Again, I'm matching up center back to the seam of my mock neck like so. Again, I sew the mock neck itself with a straight stitch, but you can see I'm setting back to my weird overlock stitch, and I will sew that right sides together, basically just binding the neckline with like a really wide binding that becomes the standing collar. I'm just trying to stretch this in an even way so that it doesn't end up with like too much excess in one area and not another. But you can see I'm holding a lot of this at tension so that the stretchiness works for me. Again, I'm newer to knits, and clearly I do not know how to explain them because I barely know what's happening in the moment, let alone now here in hindsight. And again, I will do my top stitching all around the neckline here, basically holding the seam allowance into the shirt itself and pressing that down as I top stitch from the outside with a zigzag. This needs to stretch, especially to try and get this darn thing over my head, so I cannot use a straight stitch here for top stitching. I need to use a zigzag. But again, in this fabric, it gets lost pretty fast. And yes, I do have tie-dye stained hands still, so you're noticing that. Here's what's happening. Lots of tie-dye in my life. Alright, so here's that. Again, the neckline is done, the shoulder seams are sewn, and again, I can set my sleeves in flat, sew the underarm seam and the side seam all in one again, just like I did for the cotton version, only this time in this iridescent black spandex. Again, I will just turn the sleeve ends inside 1/2 inch and hem that down using the same stitch, even though my machine was fighting me on it, like I was saying. It kept coming unthreaded and my thread kept getting all wound up on itself. I don't know what the heck this machine was doing, but other than frustrating the crap out of me and making me miss my 99. And then I hemmed the shirt itself the same way. So I just turned this up 1/2 inch or under 1/2 inch along the hem of the shirt and stitched that down. Once again, it'll always be tucked in, so I never worry about my hems very much on shirts because no one will ever see them except for me. like so. Okay, so here's what this one looks like. And oh my, that tiny shoulder has finally shown itself. Need to bring that out like at least, I don't know, 5/8 of an inch, because yikes. Also, this fabric shows every everything, so be careful with that. Would be better with a long line bra to help me smooth out my personal side seams, as it were. But yes, this was very hard to get on over my head, and I quickly learned I needed to make that neckline a little bit larger if I wanted to use this pattern with this kind of fabric. But here I'm adding on that extension to the shoulder line. Oh my goodness, let's put a good 5/8 of an inch here at the arm side, or at the outer edge, and then I'm going to take a 1/4 inch off the neckline, like so, because I need to bring that neckline out to make it a little bit larger so I can get these things over my head. Yikes. And then again, yeah, bringing that shoulder tip out at least 5/8 of an inch on both the front and the back. The rest of this is fitting okay. I should bring it in at the waist a little bit, but I'm not thinking about that now for some reason. Also, I had made my sleeve a 1/2 inch longer for that, and it was too long, so I'm going to pull that back off as well. Like so. And then I made the collar, of course, taller at some point, because I wanted my mock neck to be taller. For this next version, I'm going to go ahead and make this into a dress as opposed to a shirt. So I'm going to take my stretch skirt pattern that you've seen me make on the channel before. I'll put a card up to that. And I'm going to tape this, the skirt waist along the top waist, like so. Now you can see how much bigger the waist of my top is compared to the waist of my skirt. The skirt nips in a lot more, and that's because my top is a little bit big. I was holding this up to my old, like, slapdash, even more slapdash dress pattern from working on Synapse, and I was thinking, shouldn't I nip this in a little bit more? And the answer is yes, but you'll see I don't, which was a mistake. But I just taped my skirt pattern to my top pattern along the waist, and if, you know, you're using the same person, the measurements should mean that that lines up pretty well. So there's that. But I will do the same, take another tracing of this skirt pattern and tape it to the back for the same idea here. So I just need to trace a copy of that to do so. Again, taping along the waist, matching up the waistline of the skirt and the top, like so. And now I have a dress pattern. Like magic, you know? So I have my front and my back, making sure that the side seam still lines up and nothing got screwy. Yep, we're good. And now I can use this to make a dress version. That's right, it's the exact same process. Now, a dress, when we're talking about stretchy like this, something this simple, the only difference between a top and a dress is how long it is. So really, this is, you know, not hard modification once you have the top and once you have the skirt, to just tape the waist together temporarily and make a dress. So I'm going to be using this stretch velvet with a metallic iridescent finish on it. It kind of looks like a patina to me, and I really like this weathered iridescent finish on this black stretch velvet. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out all my pieces of this fabric instead. This is kind of in between the stretchiness level of the cotton and that last spandex I was using. This again is more on the spandexy side, but it's a little bit stretchier than the last fabric. So I have, between that and some of my modifications, I have good hope that this will fit. Again, that last shirt, it fits okay, but it's just not the most comfortable thing ever because of that fabric needing a little bit more ease in general. And that's the kind of thing you can really only learn using it. I don't know. It's hard to know with stretch fabrics how much ease you're going to need, which is very irritating to me. And I don't really plan on becoming an expert in these things, honestly, because I'm going to stick to my wovens, if I'm honest. This was fun and all, but other than figuring out a couple other tops that I like, I will be sticking with wovens most of the time. This is just not my area, really. But because there are some epic metallic finishes I wanted to play with, I wanted to give it a try, you know? It's important to experiment, right? Kind of stretch thine self, as it were. Yeah. Alright, so same order of operations for this as the top. I have my collar piece here. I will sew that shut with a straight stitch. Then I have my sleeves, and I have my, you know, dress front and back, as opposed to top, front and back. My sleeves for this, I did have to do like a wide sleeve cuff on there because my fabric, I didn't have just enough fabric. I had just enough fabric to do the sleeves if I did them in like pieces. So I didn't have enough to do the full length of sleeve on here, unfortunately. So I cut out like a 3/4 sleeve and then a really long cuff to do that, which worked out pretty well. Basically just had to do the sleeve in pieces, essentially. But again, just like the tops, I'm going to sew the shoulder seam first on either side here, front and back together along the shoulder, then put the mock neck on around the neck, then do the sleeves flat again, do the entire side seam of the dress and underarm seam of the sleeve at the same time, just like I was doing with the tops. It's just longer because it's a dress like this. But the idea stays the same. The operation doesn't change much other than just takes longer because that little funky stitch over on the machine actually is quite slow because, again, it's doing too many stitches per inch, honestly. And I can't keep up with what's going on, but it's doing some sort of weird magic. It just takes a bit, and I'm impatient, so that's a shame. And here are my really long sleeve cuffs, or sleeve extensions here, that I have to sew onto the end of my sleeves. Basically doing that the same way I sew on the mock neck collar. So, same idea here, just on the sleeves, so that I can have sleeves long enough, because even then these are a little bit on the short side, but I only had so much of this fabric left. I did use a little bit of this fabric already to add some color blocked panels to a jacket I made, but I used it in the woven way, as I prefer to do when using these fabrics, is to just, I don't know, stick some interfacing on the back them in some way, and pretend they are woven, because, again, knits are not my favorite. But this knit in particular, this particular fabric right here, might be my favorite, because, I mean, look at it. It's delicious. I always say I want to look like an oil slick puddle in like a neon back alleyway, and this is basically that exact effect. But because I did the cuffs kind of on the sleeves, the extensions on the sleeves, the same way I did the mock neck, I didn't actually have to hem those. I just had to hem the bottom of the dress, which is what I'm doing here. Again, just turning that up a ½ inch and stitching it with my weird stretchy stitch, which probably has a name if I were to pull my manual back out and check it out. But with the hem, this dress will be finished, and all I really need to do in the future is to nip in the waist a little bit more, because the skirt had it right. I needed to bring that waist in. And here is my finished mock neck long sleeve metallic velvet dress in this lovely iridescent patina colored black velvet. It does shed a tiny bit of sparkle, this fabric, but I think it's worth it. It's not true glitter, it's just sort of sparkle film that kind of gets left behind on your hands. I am quite happy with how this dress came out, even if I could have nipped the waist in just a little bit further. It's something I will keep in mind for the next time I use this pattern. I'll go ahead and adjust the pattern a little bit to be more nipped in like the skirt originally was. I now know why my skirt was a little bit pinched in at the waist compared to the top pattern I had come up with. I was giving myself a little bit more ease for tops, but I really do like the waist to be quite nipped in. I hope you enjoyed seeing how this mock neck pattern came together today, and thank you as always for watching. I'll be back with some more knit projects for you again next week, including that gathered shoulder one that everyone's been requesting. Don't worry, it is coming, but we had to make this pattern first before we could make that one, so hold on to your hats. It's coming soon. And thank you as always for watching today. I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye.